You know, when you first step off the plane in the Philippines, everything feels like an escape. The heat, the noise, the complete different rhythm of the streets. Nobody really talks about or kind of warns you what happens when the vacation part of it ends and everyday life actually starts to begin. Looking back, I don't think I really realized how much moving here had changed me until recently. You know, you spend decades building a particular type of life, you know, here back in Canada, which I'm going to assume it would feel the same in any developed country. You know, you're always running on the treadmill of schedule, stress, constant planning for the future. And then all of a sudden you drop yourself in an environment that operates on a totally different frequency. And somewhere along the way, this kind of stopped feeling less like an adventure or holiday or break, and it started feeling like more like real life setting in. You know, there's a few things that hit you right off the bat. You know, the different noises that you wake up to. There's definitely a different vibe, a different energy you feel right away. I think the biggest thing I had adjusting with was basically letting my brain adapt to almost not feeling guilty. I got to wake up and accomplish something right away. You get this overwhelming sensation of just everything's okay and it's perfectly fine to be relaxed in the moment. And not having that guilty feeling of actually not being pushed to do something right away. You know, there's a real big difference between doing things rushed around to do errands and then having a checklist to doing things more intentionally. You know, you're taking your time, maybe walking down to the local market, engaging with the vendors. You're starting enjoying those moments a lot more. It's got more in depth and more rich, and you start accepting that tasks take just as long as they take. And it doesn't feel like you're watching the clock. That energy of having to watch the clock really starts to slip away. You know, some of the harder adjustments, not necessarily the unpredictable traffic or, you know, the heat being overwhelmed, or learning where all the markets are and how they navigate inside the markets, what, you know, the wet market versus the dry market. These are not all the hard things that are hard to learn. The hardest part was actually unlearning one thing. And, you know, you spend decades perfecting back home, and honestly, it's almost broke me before I could even figure it out. Unlearning the hustle. Sounds simple, but it is actually very difficult. You know, you start realizing you're not treating your life as a project to be managed, but rather an experience to be lived. And this is something very valuable. And it's pretty hard to explain until you're actually in the present moment and experiencing it and going through it. And you can really decipher the difference between the two of them. And I would argue there's a very big difference of financial pressure versus time wealth. And yes, your money does go further here, but the real currency you gain was the time. That's the big one. And it's not something that happens right away, not for me anyway. Being in such a long system of expectations of how fast I got to go ahead and what you got to plan and what you know, managing your time. This is something you can't just unload overnight. And this is one of the things that I really struggled with actually the hardest and the longest, because I felt a little bit uneasy and uncomfortable in the beginning. And it sounds very silly, but it's one of the things I've really started noticing. It was almost giving myself permission to feel comfortable. That was actually what it comes down to. You know, telling yourself it's completely fine to take your time, be comfortable, stroll along. You don't have that schedule. Actually spending that time on myself without feeling like lazy or failing in some ways. You know, I'm not in that constant trap of comparing and having to make sure I'm doing things correctly. You know, and I always think back, and this is a very difficult one as well, because you know, this is not how we do it back home. This is completely different. This structure is completely different. And that conscious decision to make yourself stop and start accepting. And, you know, that word accepting doesn't mean you're sacrificing anything. By all means, it actually opens your eyeballs to a lot better system if you allow it to be. You know, you can almost start feeling your body letting go. You know, there's physical signs of burnout that slowly start fading away. It's almost like you can take a deeper, fuller breath and feel like this is totally okay. And again, I got to repeat, this is not something that, you know, that I could deal with right off the bat. It wasn't like a switch. It was something that I slowly started noticing. And again, it's hard to pinpoint it, but you just start feeling it, how your anxiety, your baseline anxiety starts dropping, and you realize you didn't even check your watch in hours. You're not running on that old system of like, okay, hyper accelerated. You got to be here. You got to do this on time. This is the checklist. And it's kind of odd, funny, maybe strange, how the things that used to really frustrate me the most are exactly the things that ended up shifting my perception. You know, when you actually take the time and stop fighting the environment starts teaching you something. And it's up to you to start listening to that. And I would say that this is pretty much was one of the hardest things to start adapting and really accepting and learning. You know, people always talk about the brownouts here, you know, and they can be pretty significant in a long time. And, you know, and at first losing that power felt like a massive disruption in your day. But, you know, eventually it becomes a forced reminder to disconnect, sit outside, just breathe and enjoy. And it's kind of funny because in my particular area, you know, you can always tell when there's a brownout or an internet connection gone, because everybody all of a sudden starts to mingle outside, you know, or near the pool or something like that. You know, and now when there's a brownout, you just realize, oh, you know what? This will be a perfect day to go out in the mountain, go explore, go hit the waterfalls, go swimming. You know, in some ways, you could look at it, there's a little bit less personal space as well. That feels like there's always a busy kind of feeling. You know, back home, you can be more isolated in your bigger house. You don't go out as much or whatever, or you know, you don't have that feeling that it's really crowded with security guards and people shoulder to shoulder and stuff like that. And you would think this can be exhausting when you're going to a place that has that kind of contrast. But you slowly start finding out, you know, when you start going to your regular places and the security guards recognizing you, and even though it's busy and stuff like that, everybody's got more of an open, kind of friendly way of going about themselves. And there's much more communication and feel more involved, you feel more in depth. And yes, I did have to learn my patience. And sometimes, you know, you're in the lineup or people cut in front of you. And I will say in the beginning, it was a lot harder of an exercise to really start learning because, you know, back home, I'm not used to that. People are very different pattern, you know, so they'll make sure that, oh, did I cut in front? They'll move aside, which is quite the opposite. And you would think those kind of things are very frustrating, and they can be if you let them get to you. But I find that I was actually a very good teacher of being patient, realizing, you know what, I'm not on a schedule. I'm not needing to get this done this particular moment. Who knows? Maybe they're falling behind. Maybe they got to rush out and pick up the kids. Who knows what the reasoning is? But when you allow yourself that space and that time to reflect on everything, it really makes a huge difference in your life. Yeah, you know, there'll be times I kind of miss some things, you know, back home or whatever. Nothing's utopia. Sometimes it's certain foods. You know, sometimes it's the convenience of things. Sometimes it's just being able to use certain conveniences a lot simpler and easier. There's definitely a lot more predictability and a lot of, I don't know, especially when you're crossing the street or something like that. People stop at the crosswalk here, whereas there, you can't count on that by any means. So nothing's, you know, completely perfect and rosy. Just want to be clear of that. I'm not trying to sell any vision of that. But when you weigh those minor inconveniences against the profound mental clarity you've gained and your perspective and able to make these kind of shifts, they far outweigh the other negatives if you put them all together. And I would even argue to teach you something about patience and being in the moment. But I didn't just make these changes to have a, you know, beach lifestyle or complete cheaper way of living and different foods. And I wouldn't even say I did it completely disrupt my routine, but it definitely was a disruptor and it allowed me to see things in a different perspective. The biggest goal was stepping out of the system that was slowly burning me out and taking its toll heavily. And I do have that very distinct feeling of being able to go back and forth is something that lets me really analyze different steps of it. This, you know, I don't know what the future is going to look like going back and forth 50-50 split. And I'm not even sure where this 50-50 split will eventually lead me long term, if I'm going to be longer in one place or in the other, or even go to a different, a completely different spot. But one thing I know for sure, it's really allowing me to see things in a very different perspective and analyze what's the most healthiest and mental clarity that you can have and finding that fulfillment about life. But I guess in one way to kind of sum it up as well, you know, sometimes you just have to completely remove yourself from the world, or the world that you've created for yourself, to be more precise. And then that gives you a little bit of space to try and figure out what actually matters. And these are some of the things I really like to share, and maybe you can leave some suggestion comments as well. And moving here has definitely forced me to slow down, and I needed that guidance and that being forced. And by me becoming, you know, comfortable with slowing down and accepting that some things are uncomfortable, but on a different pace. And I guess the most important thing, it just gave me room to breathe and analyze it. You know, if you're ever feeling the same kind of exhaustion with the way things are, maybe the answer isn't necessarily working harder. Maybe it's just stepping off the track entirely. And I'm not saying this is for everybody. I'm not saying everybody needs to move to the Philippines either, but it sure did open my eyes on a lot of things, and it was very worth doing to have that different perspective. And allowing a culture to teach you something, I think, is very important. Instead of trying to go to some place and change it, let it change you, and let to see what kind of doors it can open. After all, I think we're all here to try to find the most meaning and happiness in our own life, in our own little world that we create, and what is the value of that. And these are some of the things I really like to share. You know, and it's never too old to change your path you're on. In fact, literally, it's just never too old. No matter what stage you're at, there's always ways to step off that cycle and journey into a new area and new way of life, new way of thinking, to really gain your internal and happiness that you've always been seeking. And I've been very thankful for the Philippines to actually help open those doors. In a lot of cases, they were forced, but this is a good thing. Anyway, I just want to make a quick little video about that. I feel it was interesting to share. If you guys got some comments, I'd be greatly appreciated to drop them in. I appreciate all your support. And everybody take care, and I'll see you in the next one.